The moment the stagecoach stopped, the ground shook hard enough that Elias Thatcher thought an earthquake had hit. But it wasn't the earth. It was her. A giant Apache woman stepped out. So tall, her shadow swallowed the entire porch. So powerful, the horses reared back in fear. And so calm, it felt like she owned the wind itself. Elias froze. This wasn't the delicate bride he had ordered. This was a woman who looked like she could lift a horse and break a man's fate with a single decision. For the first time in his life, Elias wasn't just surprised, he was terrified. Elias had wanted a promise. He had wanted the gentle hush of a presence in a house that had grown too big with memory. He'd pressed his name to the scrap of paper without thinking how a photograph could be a lie, or how a longing could be bartered. 3 years after fever took his wife, and the rooms of his home learned how to echo, Elias had believed a small advertisement could stitch him back together. When the paper promised delicate, kind, willing to work, he pictured a soft laugh and pale hands that fit gently into his own. He pictured the quiet kind of life men in the town approved of, measured, tidy, manageable. He had not pictured thunder. Wiyaka carried thunder in her shadow. When she spoke, the sound was not loud so much as it was inevitable. The kind of voice that makes people listen, because it is anchored in truth. She stepped down from the stagecoach with a valise that had clearly been used to a long road and wore a leather dress trimmed with fringe that whispered like moving grass. Her braid hung to her waist, threaded with small beads and a bright shell, a memory of the mountains she had come from. Her face was not meant for teasing or for hiding. It was honest, carved by years of weather and laughter and grief. Wiyaka had been raised among the cliffs and sage where the elders taught children how to read the sky. She had learned to carry more than her share, not out of burden, but out of necessity, to hold the wounded, to lift gates, to carry baskets of corn down trails younger legs could not manage. She brought with her stories that smelled of cedar and smoke, and the patient, stubborn work of survival. When she looked at Elias that first evening, she did not flinch at his stiff smile or the faint pity in his eyes. She saw a man whose loneliness had become part of his shape and who had tried to fix that shape with ink. The town saw differently. Children pointed. Men tried not to laugh but failed. Women whispered. Some called her a curiosity. Others called her an affront to propriety. They had all read the same paper, seen the same photograph they thought would arrive at Elias's doorstep. None of them had expected a woman who filled the horizon like a new hill. Elias wanted to go home and pretend none of it had happened. He wanted to tuck the photograph into his pocket and walk to the post, demanding a refund, demanding the version of hope he'd paid for. But when Wiyaka crossed the yard carrying his bag with a steady hand and set it beside his door, she smiled in a way that did not demand he be small. She smiled as if to say, "We will see what we should be." At night, when the house exhaled and the moon came like a witness, she sat by the stove and stitched his shirts the way the elders had taught. Each stitch a place to hold memory. She hummed a low melody while she worked, the tune threading through the rafters until the house remembered a new kind of presence. It was not the delicate laughter of a hired companion, but it settled him with an even sort of warmth. Children from the street began to come around because she could lift them to the porch rail and tell them legends they had never heard. Stories of stars that are alive and of rivers that remember names. The first twist came on a day that smelled like change. A stranger in a suit too new for the prairie arrived with a photograph in his hand and the kind of smile that mistook business for kindness. He had connections and money and the audacity to insist he could fix a mistake. "There's a woman," he said at the counter of the mercantile, spreading the photograph like a contract, "who matches the ad. A family in the East has need of a husband to care for her. They'll pay handsomely. It's only right you return what is not yours." The town leaned into the drama. Gossip is a crowded church in a place that thirsts for spectacle. Elias felt a familiar ache at the thought, the ache that had driven him to ink and stamp in the first place. He thought of the quiet evenings he had imagined. Soft music, tea, someone to sew the buttons back on. Wiyaka saw the photograph the man displayed and touched the paper with a thumb that knew the feel of bark and river rock. She did not look away in shame. She did not demand he be grateful he had her at all. She simply said, "What did you expect would come with me?" What has your heart wanted all this time? When Elias hesitated, the world around him tried to answer for him. Old friends gave him advice like bandages. They told him the sensible action was to take the opportunity for a return, a correction, to choose the photograph over the truth of a woman who had folded herself into his life by acts rather than promises. Wiaka watched him with quiet patience. She brought him a cup of coffee, and in the steam rose the simplicity of the choice, fear or courage. She taught him, in small ways, how to be brave, not by grand speeches, but by the steady rhythm of small mercies. She dug into his garden and planted beans in the spring, because food was something that kept grief from eating a man alive. She mended tattered shirts and patched the roof after winter's sigh. She laughed loud enough to make the wallflowers in the parlor peek out, and when the children came for stories, she wrapped them in a warmth that belonged to none of the townsfolk and to all of them at once. Months wore on, and Wiaka's presence rearranged the town's measurement of things. Men who had once tossed barbed remarks found themselves asking for help when their wagon axles broke. Women who had once cursed under their breath lent her flour when she asked. It was not that the town forgot how foolish and cruel they had been. They simply began to see one another in ways that uncovered the soft underwork of community. Then drought came like a fist. The creek shrank to a line, and then to mud. Cattle fell silent in their pens. The preacher's voice in church wavered. People whispered about leaving, about selling what little they had and following promises elsewhere. Hunger makes even the hopeful practical, and practicality is the enemy of tender rebellion. Wiaka did not wait to see which way the town would fall. She stood at dawn and walked the ridges and listened. When she returned, she carried news. There was a trickle under the knoll east of town, a spring fed by a seam of underground water, if only they would look and work. Men laughed. It was the kind of notion that sounds like superstition. But Wiaka's eyes had learned to read the land, and she invited the town to dig. At first the men scoffed. Why should a woman who was not of their kind tell them where to dig? But the desperation in their bones gave way to effort. They came with shovels and curses and a secret hope that if the water came, so might the mercy. Day after day, they dug beside Wiaka, and at first the ground gave them stones and sweat. The children ran their hands in the dust and found small treasures. The town began to talk in the language of work rather than gossip. When the water finally sprang, not a grand fountain but a steady, honest flow, the sound was like the world given back. Men wept and clapped one another on the back. Even the sheriff, who had once looked at Wiaka with suspicion, felt the old lines of judgment blur. The well did not belong to any person. It belonged to the marrow of a small town that had learned to stand together. The second twist came when the Eastern man tried again, this time with offers that glittered. Money, land deeds, a chance to move to a place where people wore their comforts like armor. He assumed the photograph would call like a net, and that a woman would be tempted by a tidy life. He did not reckon Wiaka's decision-making or Elias's newly formed courage. Wiaka met him under the shade of the new well's lip and listened while he named numbers and conveniences, as if lives could be priced. She did not throw his money back. She did not accept his gilded version of home. She told him plainly that the life she wanted was a life tied to people who had learned to keep one another alive in hard seasons. "You can have your photograph," she said. "It is only paper. I will not be traded like a bolt of cloth. I will teach anyone who will listen how to plant, how to read the sky, how to carry another's grief until they can stand on their own." The man left with his arrogance dented, and the town, watching, began to understand that Wiaka's refusal was the truest kind of giving. She kept herself so she could give more. Elias, whose hands had trembled in the face of the first offer, felt a strange and wonderful steadiness settle in his chest. He realized that the promise he had longed for was not the delicacy of appearances, but the integrity of a person who would stand by another. The drought finally broke into seasons again, but the most dangerous night came in a different form. Fire. A spark in the Miller barn leapt into straw and fed on dry wind. Flames raced like animals let loose. The town ran with buckets and blankets, human bodies against a wall of heat. When someone cried that little Annie Miller was trapped in the bell tower, silence fell like a stone. Wiaka did not stand back and watch history repeat itself. She grabbed the longest rope, wrapped it around her waist, and with the brute gentleness she had always carried, climbed the ladder that shivered beneath her weight. Men held their breath as she heaved the heavy bell aside, crafted a cradle for Annie, and began the slow descent. Below, Elias and others held taut the rope as if it were a hope. Wiaka's arms, broad and sure, lowered the child like a blessing. She handed Annie to a trembling mother, and when the blaze lunged for roofs, she wrapped herself around a stretch of thatch, holding Ember at bay long enough for men to beat it into surrender. That night the town changed irrevocably. Old jokes about the giant turned into ashamed apologies, then into stories told with reverence. Wiaka's size ceased to be spectacle and became instead the measure by which a new kind of bravery was taught to children. Be useful, be kind, be fierce when mercy needs you. In the years that followed, the orchard Wiaka planted by the well grew into a grove that shaded games and prayers. Elias learned to call her his wife not with the timidity of a man haggling over fate, but with the easy confidence of someone who had been given more than he deserved and decided to steward it. He mended fences not because he needed to prove himself, but because he loved the life they had built together. They kept a jar of preserves on the table and a bowl for any child who wandered in. The final, tender twist arrived slow and unannounced, like a seed growing toward the light. Annie Miller, who had been a child when Wiaka lowered her from the bell, came to Wiaka years later with a spoon she'd carved from a sapling that had survived a storm. "You saved me," she said, voice small with the weight of what gratitude becomes when it grows up. "You taught me how to be brave for others." Wiaka laughed, a sound like wind through leaves, and pressed the spoon back into Annie's hand. "You brought back the root," she said. "We keep what is given." Elias watched them from the porch and felt the whole landscape of his life rearrange itself into something he barely recognized as his own. Softer in places, stronger in others, cleaner of the grit of loneliness. He remembered the advertisement he had clipped, the photograph that had promised a gentle hand. He moved the paper from his pocket and, for the first time, did not feel the urge to compare. He realized that life's bargains rarely come neat and that the truest goods, the ones you hold on to when it's raining, are not those you can order. People came then to the prairie to see the well in the grove, but more often to learn. They stayed for lessons in kindness and left with the knowledge that being delicate had nothing to do with being small. They learned that strength could be as tender as a spoon and that love could be as wide as a woman's arms. On the porch at dusk, Elias would take Wiaka's hand, and they would sit like two notes in a song, finally finding their harmony. The town no longer measured anyone by photographs. They measured one another by the small ledger of deeds. Who helped, who forgave, who showed up when the bell needed lifting. If anyone asked Elias how it had felt to receive thunder instead of lace, he would smile and say simply, "At first I thought my world had been stolen, but it turned out the world had only decided to teach me how to be larger in love. Sometimes the thing you think you ordered is only a paper showing you what you don't yet know you need." When the moon came up and the orchard breathed its quiet hum, the prairie slept easier, knowing that a man who once counted on a photograph had learned to count the heartbeats beside him. In the end, what had been delivered, a life, a partner, a community, was not what the advertisement promised. It was better. It was real, made of sweat and song, and the stubborn, everyday mercy of people who learned to keep one another alive.